Knowledge is knowing that a tomato is a fruit. Wisdom is knowing that a tomato is a vegetable. Now, you've probably heard it said that at least technically a tomato isn't a vegetable at all, but a fruit. This is kind of obviously silly. Look, this is ridiculous. But it's packaged up with the word technically, which makes people believe it anyway. The word technically, in this sense, is a sneaky trickster word, which means there is a sense, a very particular, scientific, precise sense, in which, even though it's false, even though it's obviously silly and wrong and false, this daft idea that I'm trying to convince you of, in this one very particular, scientific, specific, precise sense, is true. And not only that, but this one particular, very scientific sense, that one's reality, that one's fact, officially sanctioned truth, whereas what you think, just the lived experience of you and every other human being on the planet, and the decades of personal first-hand evidence you've accumulated over the course of your entire life, that is a very elaborate and convincing urban myth. Let me give you an example. I was in the pub, and a guy next to me turns to me and says, "You know, technically, magenta is not a colour." Did you know purple is not a real colour? It was invented in 1992 as a way of avoiding telling children that aubergines are just bisexual. Now you know! Now I know where this comes from. It comes from watching Steve Morgan not paying enough attention. Steve does this 5-minute or so bit about colour mixing and how there aren't any magenta photons in the world, but your brain kind of sees it anyway because the red and blue corners of your eye is stimulated and it has to see something. It invents a colour and calls it magenta. And I like that, taking the obviously false claim like magenta isn't real, while there's magenta right here on the screen, and making you wait for the resolution between that claim and reality, and explaining exactly what is meant by that and in what sense it's true. But the pub soundbite technically version doesn't have that. It just gives you the claim, and it can't remember the explanation. It's like asking you if you've heard the one about the corduroy pillow, and then not telling you the one about the corduroy pillow. It's annoying, isn't it? And generally most of the... It's making headlines, by the way. The corduroy pillow is making headlines. Generally most of the tomato fruit stuff online and in print does go into the details, so that's great. But the soundbite technically version persists, and it has a annoying little kicker on it. Let me show you what I mean. This is an example from sciencebab.com. It's Bob, it's sciencebob.com. Bab says, to really figure out if a tomato is a fruit or a vegetable, you need to know what makes a fruit and a vegetable a vegetable. The big question is, does it have seeds? If the answer is yes, then technically, botanically, you have a fruit. This, of course, makes your tomato a fruit. It also makes cucumbers, squash, green beans, and pumpkins all fruits as well. I mean, it also makes posh jam, fancy bread rolls, and Hume Community Garden Centre fruits, but obviously we're leaving out some of the details here, and you can assume that sort of thing is covered. One of the many problems that humankind faced when trying to set up the entirety of modern science from scratch is that all of our languages are really just designed to tell people where the lines are and which berries you can and can't eat. They contain a lot of useful words like fruit, which just means a sweet part of a tree that you can eat or drink the juice of, and vegetable, which really just means a savoury part of any other plant. That really is the level of detail we're working with here. You'll find a little bit more in a dictionary, but remember that dictionaries weren't invented for centuries after we'd been using both of these words, so even what's written in there is an attempt to describe what we all know the word should be. It's an attempt to succinctly define as many of the things that definitely are fruits as possible, without accidentally defining too many of the things which we know in our hearts aren't. And that's really it. And that's not good enough for science. Science needs precision, and botany needs a word for the ripened ovary of a plant designed by evolution to be eaten by animals so that the seeds will spread. And since basically everything in that category is something that you and I would ordinarily call a fruit, botany just borrowed the word fruit. So now that's what that means in science. And there's really very few examples of botanical fruits which aren't day-to-day fruits. Squashes, beans, but the best known is a tomato. That's actually surprisingly not disgusting. But the technically version omits all that. It just says a tomato is a fruit and leaves it at that. And sometimes, in fact, I would say usually, it adds a little kicker. Back to science, Bab. Now, don't go looking for tomatoes next to the oranges in your grocery store. Fruits like tomatoes and green beans are usually, alas incorrectly, referred to as vegetables in most grocery stores and cookbooks. Now you know. This part's just false. Botany has a very precise definition for fruit, but no definition at all for vegetable. It's too vague. It's not a word they have any use for. So, while there is a sense in which a tomato is a fruit, there's no sense in which it's not a vegetable. Vegetable might not mean anything in botany, but it does mean something in a grocery store, and it's the category that contains carrots and tomatoes and beans and squashes. If they weren't in that section, you wouldn't be able to find them. And, quick sidebar to discuss the even less sensible version of this. If a tomato is a fruit, what's this? A banana, you might have heard, is technically a herb. It's just not, is it? That's completely ridiculous. So where does this come from, this ridiculous banana herb thing? It's botany again, but this time not to do with the banana itself, but the plant it grows on. Now, an apple grows on a tree. A tree in botany is any plant that's made out of wood, essentially. Every other plant is called a herbaceous plant. And you can see where this is going. Herbaceous plant is quite a long phrase, and botanists tend to just say herb. But that is so far away from the everyday use of the word herb, which requires it to be kind of flavourful and a leaf, but not a bay leaf because that's a spice. But saying a banana goes in this category just because the plant it grows on isn't made of wood is like saying that a sirloin steak should be in the herbs and spices section because cows are herbivorous mammals. It's ridiculous. And you know it is. You instinctively know that that's wrong. Because that's how language works. It's how it's always worked. Words mean loads of different things in all different contexts, and you just switch automatically, and you don't even realise you're doing it. But because you don't realise you're doing it, and you don't think about it, you might not know it's a thing you can do. So when Bab confuses the general and botanical meanings of the word fruit, it seems fairly natural. It's kind of hard to spot where the mistake is, even if you kind of know it should be there. It's like one of those maths problems where they do a lot of algebra and then prove that 1 equals 2. And you have to go through and look for the division by zero. It's always a division by zero. But you do, if you're a nerd, because this effect is apparently strong enough to convince people that a banana is a herb, but not strong enough to convince them that counting is fake. Ultimately, I think people just really like the narrative that this obvious thing that we all have just been assuming for years is false, is really compelling. Whereas this thing that you all thought you understood that you use every day turns out to be kind of subtle and fuzzy around the edges. It just makes people uncomfortable. And that is kind of a problem for communicating any idea with any subtlety to it, which it turns out is all of them. But does it matter, ultimately? Yes. Yes, it does. No, if you think that's a herb and they're not vegetables, then I just won't eat your lasagna. And no one will get hurt. But not all words are so meaningless. Because if instead of the words fruit and vegetable, you were redefining the words man and woman. Suddenly it's not a fun science fact from sciencebab.com. Suddenly you are arguing over the humanity of an entire class of people. You are trying to argue because of some pedantic, pernickety definition that does not work, that a whole group of people should have their rights taken away. And that is not okay. Because honestly, if I have convinced you that fruit and vegetable are a little bit ill-defined around the edges, you wait until you read up about male and female. In fact, it doesn't really matter any two words. Whenever you have these two groups, male, female, religion, cult, fruit, vegetable, you'll always end up with some things that don't quite fit. And that's because there isn't a box here with all of one thing and a box here with all of the other things. There's just stuff, just everywhere. And yeah, there's a sort of clump around here. And we're all quite similar, we share a lot of characteristics, so we'll give that clump a name and maybe we call it fruits. And then there's another clump over here. We're all fairly similar to each other. And they share a lot of characteristics, and we give that clump a name, maybe vegetables. And the definition of those words is just an attempt to kind of draw a line around, as best you can, around this kind of clump without getting too much of this other stuff. But you do the best you can, and just, if you're going to be honest about it, admit that it's fuzzy around the edges, because no matter how good a definition you think you have of what makes a fruit and what makes a vegetable, some awkward person is going to turn up drinking a Bloody Mary and eating a Hawaiian pizza, and suddenly all your bets are off. This is my point. 1. Be very wary of the word technically. If you hear it, mentally delete it, see if the sentence makes sense. If it doesn't, probably at best useless. Number 2, be very wary of anyone trying to sneak a technical definition into an everyday sentence. It might be they're just trying to be precise, or it might be that what they're saying doesn't make sense unless you conflate the technical and the everyday definitions of the word, in which case they're trying to trick you. Number 3, don't expect words to have very strict definitions. I've seen a philosopher talk for about 45 minutes trying to debunk the idea of gender identity on the basis that its definition is kind of fuzzy and doesn't work in a scientific or philosophical setting. And well, not as the word chair or art or vegetable or currency or fish. But these are real things and we all understand what we mean by them. Language isn't a prescriptive set of rules about how the world works. It's a loose description of the world. And the dictionary is a loose description of that language. That, ultimately, is what I'm trying to say. Language is fuzzy and vague and a bit rough around the edges, and that's part of its charm. And second, these are vegetables, deal with it.